Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Sapna Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed and seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, marketplaces, and consumer. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an ecosystem to help early stage founders in the retail and consumer sectors. Retail X Series includes events, a YouTube channel, a Slack community, resources for founders, and this podcast. In this podcast, I interview founders, investors, and experts in the retail space, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Sapna Shah. Today's episode is all about retail tech from the perspective of a brand founder who sees, evaluates, and ultimately implements retail tech products, including ones from early stage companies. Our guest today, Monica Breuer, is the CEO and founder of Monica and Andy, a children's apparel brand. Monica will give her take on how she thinks about incorporating new technologies into her brand's website and guide shops. Welcome to the podcast, Monica.
Thank you so much for having me, Sapna. Thrilled to be here.
I'm very excited to have this conversation because, as we spoke earlier, this is a topic that is really near and dear to many early stage founders' hearts, really trying to understand how kind of B2B tech really gets implemented from the other side versus their side. So let's just start with a little background. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so it's funny. I come from a very unconventional background to be a founding entrepreneurial CEO. So there was nothing about my previous life. I was actually in the pharmaceutical industry, worked for Pfizer and Novartis for a decade. Had the incredible privilege of watching my brother build one of the first direct-to-consumer brands. I actually should have learned from watching him that I should have known what I was getting myself into and been smarter than to actually do it in retrospect. But after watching him and 2010, I had lived a plant-based lifestyle for about the previous 10 years to having her. I thought a lot about organic, like what was the first things that would be touching her skin. And then as I actually had her, I remember thinking as I was shopping literally from my hospital bed after having her online, I thought parents deserve something better. They deserve something that felt more like a community. There was a thought process around the softness of the fabric. And so despite my better judgment, I went in and built my own direct-to-consumer business. And here I am.
So tell us a little bit more about Monica and Andy. Kind of what stage are you at? What channels do you sell through? Give our audience a little bit of a sense of where you are today.
Yeah, so Monica and Andy started as a direct-to-consumer organic children's clothing brand. And so it was all about GOTS certified fabrics. How could we find the softest? And the GOTS certification was really about what was the quality of the entire supply chain. And so we thought a lot about that. And so when we launched, we did it both online and in store. We had the flagship store here in Chicago at our Lincoln Park headquarters, which was also the store in our office in the back. And we decided that we were going to launch online and offline at the same time. Now, what we didn't know, Subna, because we had never done something like that before, was that offline and the stores would be such a big part of the first few years that we wouldn't even really truly start building an online business. I don't think we paid for customer acquisition until like late 2017, early 2018. So like we got the product, we sold them in person. I mean, we sold some stuff online too, but being in person was such a significant medium for us and a way to reach our customers. We were experiential retail from the beginning. So we had art, music, story time, lactation classes, birthing classes. I wanted this feeling. I remember having a new baby and being so afraid to leave. Oh my gosh, what if there's a diaper blowout? What if she's crying? And I thought as we started this community and had this store, let's bring a place where like people feel comfortable in the chaos and you're not worried about, a crying baby. We felt like the more noise, the more crumbs, the more things happening, the better. And so the brand was really about online and stores. Online is definitely the fastest growing part of the business. Obviously with COVID, we had only invested in like a few full-time stores, and then we did a lot of pop-ups. So pop-ups were customer acquisition tools. We worked with Macerich and General Growth and all of these different mall owners. And there was never long-term stints that we were planning. So as we got into COVID, some of those pop-ups started to close just as they got to the end of the leases. And then something incredible happened, which was we started a partnership with Walmart. And so now we are online at our own direct-to-consumer business. We've got a few stores and we think we can grow that footprint over time. And we have a really great partnership with a major retailer in which we can reach lots of folks in person in the 1,100 Walmart doors that we're in.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, so let's dive into the meat of this episode, which is all about the technologies. The kinds of technology I see in the Retail X audience, it's really tech for e-commerce, tech for stores, tech for marketplaces, whether that's kind of front end to back end. And I know you've been assessing and implementing tech products. And I know certainly I have sent you different startups to look at as well. And maybe this is a good time to also mention that I'm an investor in Monica and Andy. But I know you've been assessing and looking at these kind of technology products to improve your brand experience since the very early days. So maybe if you could start by telling us how you think about incorporating something into your tech stack and what are those criteria? What are you looking for?
You know what? That's a really good question. And I think that's something, if people out there are listening and are thinking about starting a business, I think the way that you think about that in the early days, I'm noticing is like really evolving as we're getting bigger and we're growing. So I think, let me break that up into two parts. So I think in the early days, you want to think about what are you really wanting to achieve? Cost is a huge factor at that point, right? I mean, it's a factor no matter where you are, but like in the early days, you're just like, all right, sales are just getting started. They're just starting to trickle in. I think making sure that you have some type of an RFP process that you're running, because sometimes you get introduced to a vendor. As you said, you get introductions. And I think one thing we've gotten better at over time is like, one, putting on the front burner the introductions that we get from folks like yourself to be like, oh, hey, this is coming as a recommendation. But then making sure that we're assessing a number of other people at the same time as we're thinking about implementing something, because there's going to be different values around cost and sometimes around specificity to what your business may need versus somebody else's. So I think that whether you're just starting or you're in a real growth phase of your business, like thinking about that, the process by which you at least look at a few different people. Because I feel like in the earliest days, we would meet somebody and we'd be like, yes, we're sold. This is what we're going to work on. We're so excited. And then I think we learned over time that making sure that you're thinking a little bit more holistically about what's possible, even as you're evaluating it from a cost perspective, can be really helpful. And then I think in later stages, it becomes really different because there's a lot more stakeholders at the table. And so we really think about like, all right, how do we put together a brief? What are we trying to achieve here? And how can we sometimes unify as a team on what that is? And we've learned in the later stages, we actually have to make choices. We can't be everything to everybody. And so the technology that supports us has to be really specific to the goal of who we need to be at this particular point in the stage. And so step one is like discussions with the key stakeholders, because sometimes it's a significant conversation that's going to actually really make crisp the goal of whatever that technology needs to deliver. And with that, you can go out and run a much better process once you're actually out speaking to vendors, and you can say, these are the 3 goals and what we need to achieve. And that can be really helpful in narrowing the field. And I will say, in the last few years, there's been such an explosion on the AI front that it's kind of upended and had us rethinking through, all right, here's how we were doing things previously to what feels like this AI explosion. Wow, there's actually tools that can completely simplify what we're doing, but there's so many more choices out there. And so it's a little bit of sometime an analysis paralysis as we're looking at all of the things that are possible to do. And it makes that brief and that unification amongst key stakeholders even more important than it was for us 2 years ago.
That's really interesting because I think one of the things, and it sounds like you're facing this from a kind of different perspective than I am, which is, in this world of AI, and I'm so glad you brought this up, what is really going to move the needle versus what are the nice to haves? And as I assess companies to invest in, you can kind of put a layer of AI on anything, really, yeah. Right? Or at least people say that. So where are the priorities that you see in the business? Are you like, even just today, let's just take an example. Are you looking at things that are more customer facing, kind of in that AI space? Or are you looking at things more on the back end, like logistics and inventory planning and things like that? Or are you looking at everything?
I think we're looking at everything in the way that you just described it, because I think that one, as we have this growing omni business, making sure that we have strength of inventory planning, that we can figure out what things we need if we can be reordering, both from a wholesale perspective and from a Monica and Andy direct to consumer perspective. So I think given the growth of the business, the back end is becoming even more important for us to have a layer of sophistication on, because we're making the decisions that we were making in the early days have become like multi-million-dollar decisions in terms of areas of investment. And so us really knowing and understanding the data and the analysis behind things. And I will add one thing too, Sapna, which is a technology is meaningless unless you have somebody that understands it and is able to run it within the organization. And I think that's something we've come up against too, is, oh, you can have this great technology, but you have to ask yourself, okay, who in the organization actually leads and owns this and can make sense of what we're getting? Because sometimes we've signed up for things. We're like, oh, this is like amazing what it can do. But if somebody internally doesn't understand how to do something with it, it becomes more of a meaningless technology for us. And so I think that's a big question that we've had to ask ourselves, which I don't think we asked ourselves as well in the early days. And then I think we've thought a lot. We're getting ready to relaunch our site. There's going to be sort of this 2.0 version of Monica and Andy, in which we're going to be able to be a little bit more specialized and tailored in the message that we're giving our customers. We have people across many different stages. They could be, gift givers that don't have kids or aren't having kids at the moment. We might have people that are just thinking about their fertility, people that are in the pregnancy and planning phase, people that have a toddler, people that have a 4-year-old. And so our ability to be able to be more specific to those customers and tailored in our messaging is a real strength for us in the future. And so I think we've had to think about, who do we want to be to our community and to our customers, and put that lens on the technologies that we're looking for. And as we think about big companies, right? If you think about something like Amazon for instance, Amazon isn't necessarily there to curate. They're there to deliver as many choices and to make those choices come to you as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So that's just an example of who they've decided to be and how well they're doing at being that persona. And so we've really had to think about, what is the persona of who we want to be, and to build the technologies around that persona, which is something I think a few years ago we would be like, oh, that's a great technology. Let's try to onboard that because it's going to make us better. And we need to be able to do these 5 things really well. I think now we've said, hey, we want to be good at these 5 things, but our real strength needs to lay in with strength 1 or 2. And we need to make decisions around like making sure that we're strong in the core things that we've decided that we need strength in, as opposed to trying to be everything to everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, in the conversations that we have with the team, some of the hardest points to be able to reach. But once we get there, it makes our ability to make decisions so much stronger. Because sometimes if you look at the team, we might have team player A, that's their goal with the technology is one thing. Team player B might be thinking their goal with the technology is something totally different. Unless we have a unified point of view as an overall team, it makes it really difficult to hone in on what we need and to get out of whatever we decide, whatever technology we might be working with. We need to be unified in what we want to achieve from that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to go back to something you said just about having people on the team who can implement the technology that you've found that looks so cool. Do you ever think at that point, maybe we would build this in-house versus using an outside vendor? Is that a conversation that happens?
Definitely. I think it just depends on what it is. I think there's examples of times where we've decided, even with our new site, it's much more customized than what we've had before. It's going to be headless compared to the way that we were doing things previously. And so I think that was an area where we had gotten to a certain place on the out of the box type of things. Mm-hmm. And we decided that, hey, well, our site needs to be more specialized to who we are. And we've reached a stage in the company in which out of the box doesn't necessarily work for us anymore. I think what's cool is if people that are listening to this are in the beginning phase of something, for instance, I think unless you're building something that's like got a significant technology focus, which would obviously be like an example of where this wouldn't necessarily be the case. But most out of the box stuff is great for early days where you're just experimenting and you're learning with things. And it's kind of cool because I think back to like in the early days when my brother had founded and started Bonobos. The folks that were building direct to consumer in those days were real pioneers. They had to build everything from scratch. It was so expensive to do. There was nothing out of the box to be utilizing. And so there were days where like out of the box choices didn't exist. And I remember those days and watching Andy do that. I think the cool thing about today is like the barrier to entry is so much lower because it is achievable to be able to put up a website without having to have a whole development team behind you that's putting that site together for you. So I think there is a time and space for out of the box, and out of the box makes it affordable to be able to actually test your product, to test the market. And that can work for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you reach a certain point, which is the point that we're at now, where there are certain ideas where out of the box is great. Let's do it. It's going to work for us in certain areas. And I think then there's other places where you're like, you know what? We're more specialized this than maybe our peers would be. And so that's how we start to make decisions about what makes sense. And I think it's important to really do a full cost analysis behind not just the monthly cost of whatever it is, whatever technology it is that you're looking at, but what's the cost from a team perspective? What's the investment maybe over the next like year or two? And that'll start to really help you to truly evaluate what the cost of something is. We used to only look at, and I'll give examples of if you're looking at tools for Meta or for selling on Amazon, it's not just the cost of the tool that you might be working with. It's what's the additional like marketing investment that you need to put behind that? What's the team investment? And so I think sometimes having that holistic look at a cost analysis will help you to have a better real idea of what that tool is going to cost you in both the short and the long term.
Is that something, as you're kind of working with vendors, are you looking for that from them to say, this is realistically, this is what our tool will cost, but here are the other things that you need to have in place?
Definitely. I think it's a great question for vendors. And I think most of the people that have pitched us that we've gotten to know, there's a lot of great vendors out there. And like I said, not everybody is going to work for everything is going to work for everybody. But we have found that the vast majority of people that we've talked to have been really upfront about what those long-term costs. Obviously, we try to do some back of the napkin math on our own to see if it makes sense. I also think one really good question, if you're just getting started, or even if you've been at it a while, is like, when can you really start to see a return on investment of whatever it is that you're investing in? And I think having that honest conversation and really being upfront with the vendor so that they can say, hey, we might be putting the segmentation tool in place for you, but we don't think that this is really going to start to show up in your numbers for 3 to 6 months. And we found vendors to be extremely transparent about things like that. And that can really help to set both teams' expectations, because sometimes when you're new and you're just getting started and you think you put XYZ in place, you expect the results to be overnight.
Yeah.
And you're looking at your number and you're like, well, hold on a second. That's the same. We just implemented this tool today, and now we're seeing the same revenue number as yesterday. And I think really understanding when there might be an inflection point is something that you should be aligned on with the people that you're working with, both inside and outside of the organization, as you implement these tools, which can also really help you to evaluate if you need them. Because if you're doing that holistic cost analysis and you didn't ask that question or think about it, and you're not going to really be driving a result on that for 6 months to a year, you might say, hey, that's just not an investment that makes sense at this moment, when you're evaluating 3 or 4 other places that can maybe move the needle for you sooner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this is like a little bit of a kind of a sidebar, but a lot of the companies in the tech companies in kind of this RetailX audience are pretty early stage. Would you work with an early stage company that maybe has only raised a pre-seed round? They're still pretty small, not a huge team, but they have an interesting product. Or do you look for more established vendors?
We would definitely work with the early stage team. I think sometimes, and it depends on what it is too. So let me give an example of, if we're going to be working, if somebody's going to own like our entire email segmentation, right? As you're thinking about whether it be Klaviyo or whether it be MailChimp or all of these other tools that are out there from a retention perspective, and we're looking at, wow, that is a huge percentage of like our day-to-day revenue. In a case like that, we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to working with somebody that's completely new, but we might want to take a few clicks before we decide to do it, because we're like, wow, we really need to make sure that that is such a big percent of what our day-to-day revenue is, that working with somebody that's been around for longer and more established might be more advantageous for us. On the other hand, sometimes people that are just getting started can give you a huge advantage, because they might have something that wasn't there a year ago or a few months ago, and it might give you just the edge you need to get to the next place. So I think there is a time and place and a risk assessment to be looking at both of those things. But we love to see new things that are getting out and like new people that have just come on, because that's where you can hit the greatest inflection point and see the biggest change in what you're doing, because it was something that maybe not everybody's using it and something that didn't exist yesterday. And so we get really excited for those new conversations, almost more so than anything, because that's where you get to see something completely different.
That is, I am sure that is very heartwarming for all those listening who I'm sure hear from a lot of people like, oh, you're too early, you're too small. So great to hear. So let's kind of get into the process of how you do this. So let's say you've identified something, maybe let's continue with the email segmentation example or something like that. How do you run a process to find the right vendor when you say, okay, we do have a need? What are your steps? And then how are you looking for those vendors to pitch you, and how long does it take? All of those kinds of things.
Yeah. So I think it starts at the stage that we're at. It starts with probably 2 or 3 key things. I think first is you really, especially as you get along and when you're very early on, I'm not a big believer in the earliest days in terms of having a business plan and a 3-year roadmap and all of those things. I think in early days, it's like you're testing the market. Is there product market fit? What can you sort of put your ear to the ground and learn from your consumers in order to hone what you're doing? I think in somewhat later years, you really need to have that 1-year and 3-year roadmap and plan, and to say, even on one page, Sapna, what are the strategic pillars of what we're trying to achieve, and like where are we trying to go? Because it starts with that alignment. And I can't say enough about how important that alignment is for folks over time. So I think that's kind of like the first thing to look at. Then I think it's that brief that we put together with the key strategic team to really evaluate and say, okay, what are the things, given that 3-year roadmap and the 1-year plan, what are the things that we're really looking to achieve with whatever this technology is? I think any good RFP process can take as little as 60 days. I think that's about the shortest from like you start thinking about it to like true implementation, all the way to 120 days, depending on like what it is. And I think the way that we've basically run that is a subset of the group that does that brief is the one that aligns to take all of the phone calls or like all of the Zooms that go along with it. The first thing that we do is go out to other founders that we're friendly with, that we believe in, and we say, how did you do this? Who are you working with? What are you thinking about? And I think that's like step one. Mm-hmm. One of the other places is we go out to like our more tech focused VCs too. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes people like yourself, right? That like they're meeting people that have the latest and the greatest technology. And that's sometimes where we find the real innovation, where if we're learning about it from another founder, it's probably going to be amazing. And it's probably going to be like somewhat more established because like multiple other founders are using it. And we'll say, okay, great. We know that Klaviyo is awesome from like an email perspective. We know 7 other people that are using it. It's not something that's brand new at that point. Yes, we feel rock solid about this. Versus I just went to a conference in May with Kota, who's one of our biggest investors and venture capitalists, and they had 2 days of AI type tech presentations, some of which were like well beyond the direct to consumer world in terms of what they were offering. But it's awesome to be able to go see that. And we might say, hey, we've got this problem to solve, Sapna. Are you seeing anybody that's out there that understands how to solve that problem? And then there's good old fashioned people email us. Yeah. And we read through our emails, and there's outreach on email and LinkedIn, and it's hard to get and see all of it, but things will catch our eye there. And I might email my co-founder, Brian, and forward it and say, hey, have you seen this? This looks really interesting. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. And so I think there's multiple ways in which you can come to people. I think references are first and foremost, but I think cold hard outreach works really well too.
That's great to hear. And then let's say you go through this process, you find a couple that are interesting, you narrow down. Do you typically start with kind of a pilot? You know, one of the big questions that the early stage founders in tech always talk about is paid pilots versus unpaid pilots versus going straight into contract, right? Like they want some certainty. The brand wants testing, right? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to figure out what the middle road is. I think at this stage, you want to be empathetic to like, okay, what do you need as a brand? And then understanding that other people that are managing these technologies also have their own business and balance sheets to be running. And so where's the right middle ground to reach? we haven't done as much unpaid, please give us for free this whole testing part of things. Not that we haven't been able to do that, but I think we also, on the flip side, don't necessarily dive headfirst into a 12-month contract anymore.
Mhm.
So sometimes we say, all right, what's like the right middle ground to be reaching? Where like, does 3 months make sense? We're like, all right, in another 3 months, if we feel like we've seen advantage from this. And again, this is all setting that expectation beforehand, because there might be things that we're implementing where we're aligned that no results are going to be seen for 6 months to a year. And the contract needs to then reflect what that looks like. But there are times where the results should be sooner, and having a contract that everybody is able to come out of. It might be that the team that you're talking to actually doesn't, maybe they don't like working with you and your team, and they want to make sure that they have a way to get out, and vice versa. Hey, we've got a balance sheet to run. We thought that we would see results with this in 30 to 45 days. We're at 90 days and none of those results are being seen. We simply can't justify this going forward. And so I do think it's a dance, but I think the more that contracts can be thoughtful on both sides of the fence, to just say, hey, what's the investment that this tech team or this technology is making in something, to make sure that we're covering through that, but not necessarily signing up for things that could be re-looked at. Making sure that it makes sense to continue is like a good idea to have consideration to as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I think that what you're saying is that it sounds like the technology vendor themselves really need to understand how they can deliver success and in what time frame to be able to actually propose something.
Definitely. Because I think that because we've reached a stage now where if somebody is upfront with us about the time frame that they think they're going to deliver, I think when you get that, and it can happen on any side of things, right? In life, you don't necessarily want people to overpromise and to underdeliver. And so we're always really wowed when people underpromise and overdeliver on things. And I think it's really understanding, is the vendor also vetting you? Do you have the person that can be managing it? Do you have the infrastructure to be supporting it? Because I'm sure there's times that like vice versa, vendors like get let down by the companies that they're working with because they put their best foot forward. And maybe we're not ready on our side to really fully realize the potential of this. And so I think I've seen it every which way at this point. But I think those good, honest conversations at the helm of the project are so important. And having a single person on the team that is at least fully responsible for the relationship. We might have a whole team of folks that are working on something, but making sure that with the vendor, there's a single person that they feel like they've built this great relationship with, so that there is more of that one-on-one. And we've tried to transition things too, where it shouldn't just be about how we're connecting over email, but what's the cadence of like the meetings that need to happen? What's the cadence of the conversations? How do we get ahead of, hey, are we aligned on, say that you're working with somebody on, let's go back to email for a minute. It's just as like the example that we continue to use. If that vendor is seeing something that's like off and they're catching it, you might want to set a precedent where, hey, if something's wrong, I don't want to hear about it at the weekly meeting. I want an immediate ping. Let's be on Slack together about this, so that everybody is sort of aligned on like how you want to manage through issues that will come up and the level of communication. And that might be different for Monica and Andy. We might be more in the over communication bucket of stuff, where other people might be like, hey, the weekly meeting's great. And so the vendor and the company that's working with that vendor really aligning on like the cadence of communications and the expectations. And then how do we really evaluate success over time?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's not the just get it implemented and then hope for the best.
Exactly.
So what kind of pricing do you typically prefer from like a tech? Let's try to make it a little more narrow, but maybe something that's customer facing, maybe e-commerce focused. A lot of startups want to price based on revenue lift, or you touch their whatever their thing is, and all of anything that goes into the basket or anything that gets transacted is kind of part of their additional revenue. Some prefer the sort of SaaS model, or by the seat, just a straight license. There's so many different models. I think one of the things when I'm just talking to early stage tech founders is they just have no idea what kind of pricing model is going to work for their product. And any insight you could give into pricing would be helpful here.
Yeah. And that's a really good question. And I think obviously like dramatically varies depending on what we're looking at. But I think that as a brand and a business, like we're very focused on, and I think the whole world now is focused on profitability. And so I think as we look at anything, we assess, okay, as we're looking at whatever, whether it's based on customers, whether it's based on like monthly fee, whether it's based on the yearly, whatever it is, I think making sure that it's like right sized to the output that it's going to deliver for the company that you're working with is really important to understand. So I think from a vendor perspective, it's great. And we see a lot of vendors that do a great job of this, but sort of understanding as for instance, like where is the company that you're speaking to? Where are they from a revenue perspective, right? If they're pre-sales versus like $100 million in sales, we'll have people that'll come to us and be like, you know what? We're probably too big for where you are. And the cost of what we're doing won't really be advantageous to you until you reach this higher end of the spectrum. Or at the same token, it might be, hey, this actually isn't going to be big enough to make as big of a bang for the buck. So I think the vendor understanding where the company is in that continuum can help them to understand their sweet spot for what their pricing might be. And some of that pricing can be tiered too, which I think is great. So if you're a vendor and you're thinking about, all right, I actually want to understand where we're most advantageous, or maybe we can work along the entire continuum, meeting people where they are. And marketing spend is a good example of that, right? If you're working with somebody to manage your meta spend, what we're paying isn't going to be the same as a company that's just starting, isn't going to be the same as $1 billion company that's out there that's doing it. It's based on what you're doing. And I think that's where people get their best pricing, is really thinking about the age and stage that people are at and what they can afford. And I think that's where we've really done our best work. And then tailoring that contract. Again, that $1 billion company, they might be able to sign up for a 2-year contract because like they can afford to take that risk and they know enough about how things work and they have a robust enough team, versus somebody that maybe is just getting started where it's, wow, if it doesn't work, them being locked into a 1 or 2 year contract could be what blows their business down. Right. So I think like having that more tailored approach on both sides can be really helpful in achieving whatever that is. But I love the idea of if there is some flexibility in there, and if there isn't, then understanding that, oh, okay, if it has to be X, Y, and Z, that people may have to reach a certain stage in their revenue and what they're doing to be able to afford it. So it isn't necessarily advantageous to have conversations with people that are just starting out, because while they could benefit from it, they just can't afford whatever the technology is.
Yeah, they just can't pay for it. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Just as we wrap up, I think one of the things I hear a lot from tech founders is that implementations with brands can be very slow. Contract is signed, then we know who the team is on both sides, and then the process dies. How do you manage that on your end, and any advice for founders of tech companies on that front?
Yeah, I think, and being on the other side of it, I think we definitely have had that happen completely in our court. I think at companies like ours, I think the hard thing is that things come up that you just aren't expecting. And all of a sudden you end up like shifting this focus, or something might change in the market. And suddenly you were going to do something and now you're like, oh, I can't. And so I think that's got to be really hard on the vendors that a lot of us work with, because it's hard to understand what's happening inside. And suddenly somebody's emailing you and like you've disappeared or whatever for a short time. So I think knowing that if you're working with, and I'm just going to use direct to consumer founders as for instance, because that's where I'm at, like things can sometimes be volatile behind the scenes in terms of just, I mean, we're just finally coming out of COVID and like production and oh my gosh, the whiplash of the last 3 years, that seems like it's finally on the up and up, but I can't, like the decisions that we were making were so difficult over that time. And so I feel like a lot of things were shifting and changing. I think as you're working with founders and teams, the more steadfast that they feel about what their plan is and what they need, the less change that you'll find over time and the more alignment that there is with that strategic team. Because I think in the early days, we would get into something and wouldn't have all the right alignment conversations. And then you get to that point of implementation and suddenly some key stakeholder is like, wait, this doesn't make sense for X, Y, and Z. So I think diagnosing from the vendor perspective, and if they could just understand Did it fall apart because like funds for it somehow fell apart and like budget fell away for it, right? And that's probably not something that's as recoverable. Unfortunately, I know that's like a decent amount of time that's been lost. Maybe it's like a key stakeholder isn't completely aligned. And maybe a conversation with that key stakeholder could help to like move the ball forward. So I think understanding why something has stalled. And I think the more transparently people can just ask too. Hey, I noticed like XYZ, we were moving along on it. Can you give me any ideas on why it stalled? Can give you a more definitive answer. If it's like, hey, we lost funding for it, then it's like the team wants to do it, but they can't. And there's probably not that many ways around it, unless then anybody wants to come back and be like, all right, well, let's test this for 60 days, which is where that could be interesting. Because sometimes you get into using stuff and it becomes so second nature that as a team, you're like, we need to make anything happen in the budget in order to be able to utilize it. But I think you kind of have to have an understanding of the why, which I'm sure can be very frustrating on the vendor side, and totally understood.
One of the things I've loved about this conversation is that you've definitely hit, I think, what is maybe your kind of overall strategic perspective, which is this alignment concept at every stage of the process and the key stakeholders. And I think that might be, a lot of that might not be visible to the vendor, right? And completely transparent to the vendor, but it's such an important thing to keep in mind. And it through everything we've talked about, you've brought it up repeatedly. So I feel like this is maybe the theme of this podcast episode. And all this advice has been great. So thank you so much. But before we sign off, my last question is there anything we haven't talked about, like a really critical piece of advice that you would give early stage founders, tech founders, as they are looking to sell into brands like Monica and Andy?
Yeah, I think keep doing the great work, because it's the work that all of these tech founders are doing that's making our jobs easier in a lot of ways in the long run. And I think the more deeply that they can understand like the needs of the business, and sometimes even say no to us. Because I think initially it's like everybody's so excited, right? The brand wants to get the revenue. The tech founder wants to get more clients and more experience. I think the more sometimes that people can take an honest view and like really be like, actually, we don't think we can help you. Or as a founder myself being like, you know what, this is going to take too long. I think the more honest the conversations can be in the early days, the more productive like the relationships can be. And so sometimes I feel that's where having those honest conversations, because it's just difficult to do so, maybe could be more fruitful in the beginning. Because I think even knowing that, hey, we know our sweet spot is working with this type of company. Maybe trying it with this company could work, but I don't know. I think the more that everybody can be upfront about the real capabilities of things on both sides of the fence and the real cost of doing it can help to build those better relationships. But I think email, LinkedIn message, like I think we're always excited to say, hey, what's this new thing that could help us? And I think the fun part of it is like, there's no barrier to like how long people have to have been doing it in order for a company like ours to try it. And we love seeing all of the new things that are out there. So it's fun to see all the good work that a lot of the tech founders are doing in order to make our jobs easier in a lot of ways, and to build better experiences for the customer and the community, which is always what we're thinking about as well.
Amazing. Amazing. Monica, thank you so much for sharing all of your kind of advice, but also your process, because I think this is opening the curtain and seeing kind of what's happening on the other side. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you so much. And I will add too that it's taken a lot of years to build that process. So I don't want anybody that's listening to this to be worried because they don't yet have it. Like, we've made a lot of mistakes along the way. We've learned a lot of lessons. I think it's taken a lot of even coaching for us executively, like having actual executive coaches to get us to a point where we're like, oh yeah, that's right. We should plan a little bit better. So I think like none of that was anything that we were born with or we walked into it with. These were all just like learnings along the way. But thank you so much for having me, Sapna. I really appreciate it.
It was great to have you. And thank you all for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another new episode out shortly.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Retail X Series, check out www.retailxseries.com for more information, including recordings of past events. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Retail X Series. You could also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.